At one Thanksgiving dinner, my grandfather set down his wine glass with deliberate care and smiled at me across the harvest table laden with turkey and sweet potato casserole. "Rebecca," he said warmly, "I hope you're enjoying the new house. The one with the wraparound porch and the garden you always talked about." The room seemed to pause. I set down my fork slowly, confusion flooding through me. "What house?" I asked. The question hung there, innocent and devastating. My mother's hand froze mid-motion, her fork suspended above her plate. My father's eyes darted toward his plate, then to my mother, then away again. Grandpa's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. He pushed back his chair with such force it scraped against the hardwood floor like a scream. "Show me the deed," he said quietly, his voice sharp in a way I'd never heard before. Now, that was the moment I realized the truth had been waiting years to break free, and I'd finally given it permission. But what they didn't know, what even Grandpa didn't know yet, was that I'd spent the last 2 weeks gathering evidence, preparing for this exact moment. My name is Rebecca Hastings, and I've spent 26 years believing that silence was the price of belonging. My parents, Michael and Susan, ran a successful medical practice in the suburbs of Nashville. They were the kind of family that looked perfect in Christmas cards, coordinated outfits, practiced smiles, the appearance of success without the substance of love. My father moved through the world like a man collecting achievements, checking off boxes on an invisible list. My mother moved through it like a woman afraid of breaking things, carefully managing emotions and keeping peace through strategic silence. The only person who ever made me feel genuinely seen was my grandfather, James Hastings. He was my dad's father, a retired investment banker with silver hair and eyes that didn't lie. While my parents told me to be practical, Grandpa told me to dream. While they lectured me about responsibility, he taught me about worth. He'd call me on random Tuesdays just to ask what I was reading, genuinely interested in my answers. He'd listen to my problems without immediately jumping to solutions. He's always interested in my life, about my steady growth. He made me feel like my existence mattered beyond what I could produce or achieve. When I was 23, living in a cramped apartment in Nashville, working as a junior graphic designer and eating instant noodles most nights, Grandpa called me. His voice was different that day, intentional and careful, like he was making a decision he'd been considering for a long time. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about your future," he'd said. "You deserve to have something of your own. Something completely yours alone without interferences or control. I've ensured you have that. No arguments." I'd laughed, uncomfortable with the intensity of his words and the solemnity in his tone. "Grandpa, you don't need to do anything for me. I'm doing fine." "I'm not asking if you're fine," he'd replied. "I'm telling you this had already happened. Trust me." 3 months later, I received an email from a real estate attorney in Knoxville with the subject line, "Property Transfer Documentation." At first, I thought it was spam, some automated message meant for someone else. Then I read it again, my hands shaking as the words penetrated. The email mentioned a deed, a house, my name printed officially on legal documents. It was real. Grandpa had actually done it. I called my parents immediately, my voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and confusion. "Mom, did Grandpa buy me a house? I got this weird email from a lawyer." The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know before anyone said a word. "Rebecca, it's complicated," my mother finally said, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when discussing difficult topics, patronizing, rehearsed. "Your grandfather. He made some decisions without consulting us properly. We're still figuring out what that means for everyone." "What does that mean?" I pressed, my excitement turning to unease. "Can someone just explain what's happening?" "It means," my father's voice cut in, cold and measured like he was addressing a patient rather than his daughter, "that your grandfather overstepped his boundaries. We're handling it appropriately." When I pressed for actual details, my mother deflected with practiced ease. "Don't worry about it, sweetie. Your father and I are taking care of everything. Just focus on your work and let us manage this." But they weren't taking care of it. They were hiding it. And I could feel the difference in their voices, the careful way they changed the subject, the urgency that underlay their casual dismissals. Over the next week, I dug deeper, driven by a growing sense that something was genuinely wrong. I called the attorney's office, pretending to be following up on paperwork related to a property I'd inherited. The receptionist was helpful, confirming that yes, there had been a property purchased 3 years ago in my name, a house in Knoxville with approximately 2 acres of land. When I asked if I currently owned the property, there was a pause that stretched uncomfortable and long. That would require verification, she said carefully, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. I'd need to check the current deed status in our system. She called back later that afternoon, her voice noticeably more cautious. Miss Hastings, I've reviewed the documentation. It appears the property was transferred out of your name approximately 2 years ago. The current owner is listed as Michael Hastings, your father. I sat in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something inside me calcify into something hard and cold. My father had sold a house that wasn't his to sell. He'd taken an inheritance meant specifically for me and liquidated it without my knowledge, without my consent, without any acknowledgement that he was doing something wrong. When Grandpa called 2 days later to confirm Thanksgiving plans and ask how I was enjoying the new house, I almost told him everything then. The words were right there on my tongue, ready to spill out. But something inside me stopped, some protective instinct toward a man who'd only ever been kind to me. I wasn't ready to be the one to break his heart, to shatter the image he had of his son. So instead, I said, of course I'll be there. I'm really looking forward to it. After hanging up, I called my friend Devon, who worked in real estate law and had always given me straight advice without sugarcoating. I think my parents stole something from me, I said flatly, not bothering with preamble. And I think I know how to prove it. Devon's response was immediate and serious. Send me everything you have. Every email, every document, everything. Then we talk strategy. For 5 days, I methodically gathered documentation. The original purchase agreement from 3 years prior with my name printed clearly as the buyer. The deed with my name and my signature. The transfer papers signed by my father, authorizing the sale and transferring ownership to himself. Bank statements showing the sale proceeds depositing into their account. Each document was a brick in the wall I was building around the truth, a foundation for what needed to happen. Have you subscribed to this channel? Please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more family drama. Devon met me at a coffee shop near the courthouse on a gray November afternoon. He spread the papers across a small table, reading carefully while I watched his face darken with each page. When he finished, he sat back and removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Your father sold property that wasn't his to sell, he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's not just a family matter. That's fraud. Criminal fraud. You could absolutely press criminal charges if you wanted to. What about Grandpa? I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. What do I do about him? He needs to know what happened to his gift. That depends entirely on you, Devon said, looking up directly into my eyes. Do you want to protect him from the truth, or do you want him to know exactly what happened? Because those are different conversations. I didn't answer immediately. Outside the coffee shop, Nashville moved forward indifferently. People living their lives without this weight, without this knowledge, without this particular burden of betrayal. He needs to know, I said finally, my voice steady. But on my terms. At Thanksgiving. I want him to know the truth. Devon nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what I was saying. Then we prepare for that. You'll need documentation present, witnesses, maybe legal representation. This isn't a casual conversation. It's an intervention. I can get Grandpa's attorney, I said, remembering Richard Whitmore, who'd been managing Grandpa's affairs for decades. He's always been more loyal to Grandpa than to my father anyway. I think he'll help. Good, Devon said. Then we have a plan. The week leading up to Thanksgiving, I rehearsed nothing. I didn't write speeches or practice confrontations in front of the mirror. I simply gathered strength, the kind that comes from finally deciding you're worth defending, that your life and your future matter more than family peace built on lies. The night before Thanksgiving, I called Grandpa's attorney, Richard Whitmore. I'd known him since childhood, a tall man with a stern face and sharp eyes who'd always treated me with unexpected kindness, taking my questions seriously when adults dismissed them. "Mr. Whitmore, I need your help," I said without preamble. "And I need your complete discretion." I outlined everything. The email from 3 years ago about the property purchase. The property in my name. The subsequent sale by my father. The documentation I'd gathered. The discovery that felt like a betrayal carved into my chest. By the time I finished speaking, Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandfather doesn't know," he said. It wasn't a question. He understood what I was telling him. "No. He thinks I've been living there. He thinks I'm enjoying it. And I think he should know the truth, but I think he should know from a position of strength, not shock. I think he needs to understand what his son did." "Then I'll be there," Richard said simply, his voice carrying the weight of commitment. "I'll bring copies of the original trust documents. Your grandfather kept them secure. They'll corroborate everything you're saying." Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and crystalline, the kind of day that feels like a beginning or an ending, depending on what you're expecting. My parents arrived early, carrying casseroles covered in aluminum foil and wearing the masks they wore around extended family, pleasant, controlled, carefully curated versions of themselves. My mother hugged me carefully, like I might break. My father nodded, his eyes already scanning the room for exits. Grandpa arrived last, moving slower than I remembered but still commanding presence. When he saw me, his face lit up with genuine warmth. "Rebecca, honey, how have you been?" "Good," I said, and I meant it. I'd been preparing. I'd been strong. "I've been good, Grandpa." Dinner was the usual performance. My parents talked about their recent vacation to Scottsdale, about the golf course and the spa. My mother discussed a charity gala she was organizing for the hospital foundation. Grandpa asked about my work, my clients, whether business had picked up since I'd gone freelance. I answered him honestly, detailing the challenges and victories, while my parents interjected with corrections, unsolicited advice, and subtle criticism. Halfway through the main course, Grandpa set down his fork and reached for his wine glass. His eyes moved to me with that particular intensity I'd come to trust, the look of someone about to say something important. "Rebecca," he said, his voice warm but with an undercurrent of something else beneath it. "I hope you're enjoying the new house. The one with the wraparound porch and the garden space you always talked about in the spring." The room went silent. Not the casual silence of dinner pauses, but the heavy silence of truth arriving uninvited and impossible to ignore. I set down my fork carefully, taking a breath. "What house?" I asked. My mother's face went pale, the color draining away like water from a sink. My father's jaw tightened visibly. Grandpa's expression shifted from pleasure to confusion to something darker, something that looked like dawning realization. "The property in Knoxville," he said slowly, his voice careful now. "The one I purchased for you 3 years ago. The house with the wraparound porch and the garden space where you could have something of your own." "I don't own a house," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling inside me. "Not anymore." Grandpa set down his glass. The stem clicked against the crystal with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire dining room. "Explain," he said. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, keeping my hands steady. The original deed with my name. The transfer papers. The sale agreement signed by my father. The bank statements. I slid them across the table one by one, watching each document land like evidence. "Dad sold it," I said simply, my voice not wavering. 2 years after you bought it. He transferred the property to his name, then sold it for profit. I didn't know until last week when I started asking questions. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face cycled through colors, red to white to an ashen gray. Grandpa stared at the documents, his hands trembling slightly as he traced the signatures, his eyes reading each word carefully. "Michael," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is this true?" My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Dad, it's not what it looks like. It's complicated. It looks like you stole from your daughter," Grandpa said, his voice cutting through like ice. "It looks like you took a gift meant for her future and sold it for your own gain. What else could it possibly be?" "We needed the money," my mother blurted, desperation leaking through her careful facade. "Our practice was struggling. The mortgage was underwater. We thought. You thought you could take what I gave to Rebecca without her knowledge." Grandpa's voice was sharp now, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "You thought you could lie about it for 2 years. You thought no one would ever find out." "We were going to tell her," my father said, desperation creeping into his tone like a wound opening. "We just needed time. We were going to explain and—" "Time," Grandpa repeated, the word heavy with judgment. 3 years of time. That was enough time. The doorbell rang, breaking through the tension like a sharp blade. Richard Whitmore stood outside, briefcase in hand, waiting. Grandpa had apparently called him during the brief silence while I was sharing my evidence. When Richard entered, he didn't ask questions or offer pleasantries. He simply placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. "These," he said, his voice formal and authoritative, "are the original trust documents establishing the Knoxville property as Rebecca's inheritance. Dated 3 years and 2 months ago. They are signed, notarized, and legally binding." He turned to my father, his gaze sharp. "And these are the transfer documents signed by you, Michael, indicating fraudulent claim to property that was never yours to claim." My mother started crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from genuine remorse, but the kind that comes from being caught, from seeing your image shattered, from realizing there were consequences for your actions. My father stood abruptly, his chair tipping backward. "You've turned her against us. Both of you have conspired against this family." "No," Grandpa said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout could. "You did that yourselves when you stole from your own daughter." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, drained, empty. But I also felt clear, like I'd finally swallowed medicine that would heal something infected deep inside me, something that had been festering unacknowledged for years. Richard placed a fresh document on the table. "I've had Rebecca's deed corrected and refiled with the county. The property is legally hers once again. The proceeds from the sale will be recovered through civil litigation if necessary." "You're suing your own parents," my father demanded, his voice breaking. "Your own family." "No," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm protecting my future from the people who were supposed to protect it." The room seemed to shrink. My parents looked smaller somehow, diminished not by my words but by the truth finally exposed to light. Grandpa sat heavily, the weight of disappointment settling across his shoulders like a coat that had become too heavy to bear. "I gave you everything," he said to my father, his voice cracking for the first time. "Everything I had, I gave to you. I taught you about honor and integrity and the importance of family. And you used that to steal from your own daughter." My father had no answer. What answer could possibly exist for such a betrayal? Grandpa stood slowly, drawing himself up. "Richard, draw up new documents. Everything I have, everything I own, goes to Rebecca. Not to Michael. Not to be shared with Michael. To Rebecca alone." "Dad," my father started, but Grandpa held up a hand. "You're done talking," Grandpa said. His voice was soft, which somehow made it more final than any shout. "Richard, they need to leave my home now." My parents didn't argue. They gathered their things in silence, my mother collecting the casserole dish she'd brought, my father straightening his tie with shaking hands. They left without goodbye, the front door closing behind them like a period at the end of a sentence. When they were gone, Grandpa turned to me. His eyes were wet, but his gaze was steady and unwavering. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have protected you better. I should have realized what was happening." "This wasn't your responsibility," I said, my own eyes filling with tears I'd been holding back. You gave me a gift. He stole it. That's on him, not you. No, he agreed, reaching out to take my hand. But you're my granddaughter. That should have been enough for me to see the truth sooner. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver key, the key to the Knoxville house. He placed it in my palm carefully, like he was offering something sacred. It's yours, he said simply. No one can take it away this time. No one. Over the following weeks, Richard handled everything with quiet efficiency. The civil suit against my parents proceeded, and they faced the consequences of their choices. My parents' financial situation became precarious as the recovered funds were returned to me. I didn't enjoy watching them struggle, but I also didn't feel guilty. They'd made their choices. I was simply living with the consequences of theirs. My relationship with my parents became cordial and distant, maintained through careful emails about logistics and obligatory family events. The intimacy was gone, replaced by the kind of polite distance you extend to acquaintances you don't particularly like. My relationship with Grandpa deepened. We started having coffee together every Sunday, talking about life and choices and the difficult business of doing the right thing. He shared stories I'd never heard, about mistakes he'd made, about learning to trust his own judgment even when it conflicted with what he wanted to believe. 3 months after Thanksgiving, I drove to Knoxville and stood in front of the house Grandpa had bought me. It was everything he described: white brick, wraparound porch, a garden that needed tending but held such potential. I turned the silver key in the lock and stepped inside. The house was empty, waiting like a blank page, full of possibility. I walked through rooms that were mine, touched walls that belonged to me, and felt something I'd never felt before: ownership that wasn't contested, a future that wasn't dictated by someone else's agenda or needs. Standing in the empty living room, I thought about all the times my parents had told me what I should do, who I should be, what I deserved. They'd been wrong about most of it. But they'd been right about one thing. I did need to learn to stand on my own. The difference was, I wasn't learning that from them anymore. I was learning it from myself, from my own strength, from my willingness to finally fight for what was mine. Justice doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it just looks like reclamation. Like standing in a room that's finally, completely yours. Like a grandfather's unwavering belief in your worth, finally validated by truth. If you've ever had family take something that wasn't theirs, if you've ever had to choose truth over loyalty, if you've ever had to protect yourself from the people who should have protected you first, tell me your story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of people reclaiming their lives from families after betrayal.